Noah Harper had always thought of his land as the one constant in a life full of loss, changes, and disappointments. The farm had been in his family for more than 3 generations, a stretch of open fields and thick woods on the outskirts of a small Virginia town where nothing much ever seemed to change. He had inherited it when his father died, just as his father had inherited it from his grandfather before him, and even though Noah's life had taken him far away from it for years, there had never been a time when he doubted that one day he would return. The place was not grand by any means. The farmhouse was old and drafty, the barns and sheds weather-beaten and leaning after decades of winters and storms, and the fences required constant patching. But to Noah it was more than property. It was a part of who he was. He had grown up running through the fields as a boy, working side by side with his father during hay season, learning to drive on the gravel driveway that wound past the barn and around to the back pasture. Every corner held a memory, some pleasant, some not, but all tied to the sense that this land was where he belonged. When his wife, Clara, died unexpectedly 5 years earlier, it had been the only place that made sense to retreat to. He had sold the modest house they had shared in Richmond, left his job at a mid-sized architectural firm, and quietly returned to the farm, hoping the quiet would help him breathe again. The farmhouse had not changed in the years he had been away, but Noah had. He was 52 now, and the grief had etched deep lines into his face, making him look older than his years. He had always been a quiet man, even as a younger architect who preferred drafting plans and managing construction sites over schmoozing clients. But Clara's death had sealed his tendency toward solitude. He kept to himself, rarely going into town except to buy supplies or groceries, and when he did, he limited conversation to what was absolutely necessary. He was polite but distant with his neighbors, even those who had known him since childhood, and he had little interest in town events or community meetings. His only companions were his old shepherd mix, Rusty, and the lingering presence of Clara in the photographs and small tokens scattered through the farmhouse. The old barn on the property, the largest structure aside from the house itself, had become something of a sanctuary. Built by his grandfather's own hands, it was more than 80 years old, its wood weathered silver gray by time. It leaned slightly to one side now and bore the scars of storms and patchwork repairs, but it still stood solid. Inside were tools, farm equipment, and decades of Harper family history. Noah had long planned to restore it properly, reinforcing the beams, replacing the roof, and making it a place he could work and store the equipment he had slowly acquired. Clara had loved the barn, too, and he had a sketch she had once drawn of it framed in his study. He often told himself that one day, when he finally had the energy and money, he would bring the barn back to life, maybe even turn part of it into a studio the way Clara had always wanted. The town around the farm had changed more in the past decade than it had in the previous 50 years combined. When Noah was young, it had been a rural community where everyone knew everyone else, where you could drive down the main street and recognize nearly every face you passed. But over the last 10 years, developers had discovered the appeal of the area. The fields and woods had begun to shrink as new houses sprang up, followed by apartment complexes and sprawling shopping centers. Once quiet roads became congested, and the sense of familiarity that had defined the town gave way to the anonymity of suburban sprawl. Noah had watched it happen with a mix of resignation and bitterness, though he tried to keep his opinions to himself. He knew that the farm was considered prime real estate now, a large tract of land that could be divided and sold for millions, and he had received more than a few letters from developers expressing interest. He had never responded. He had no intention of selling, not for any amount of money. This land was not just acreage to him. It was the last tangible connection he had to his father, his grandfather, and to Clara. On a humid Saturday afternoon in early June, Noah drove into town to pick up supplies at the hardware store. The square was busier than usual, clogged with SUVs and minivans bearing out-of-state plates. He had nearly forgotten that the town was hosting its annual summer fair, a tradition that dated back decades. He had not attended the fair since returning to the farm, and he had no intention of doing so now. He parked near the back of the lot, hoping to get in and out quickly, but as he stepped out of his truck, he overheard a conversation that made him pause. Two men in polo shirts and khakis were standing by a booth set up near the entrance to the fairgrounds. One of them was gesturing toward a large poster board that displayed glossy renderings of what appeared to be a new housing development. The words Haven Heights were printed in bold letters across the top. Noah glanced at it out of habit, intending to keep walking, but then he heard one of the men say something that stopped him cold. "And we'll be incorporating the Harper Tract into Phase 2 once it's cleared. That'll give us another 50 acres for the southern lots." Noah felt a flash of anger and confusion. The Harper Tract was his land. He stepped closer, not enough to draw attention to himself, but close enough to confirm that the map on the poster included his property, marked out in bright yellow like all the other parcels slated for development. He wanted to confront the men then and there, demand to know who had authorized them to use his name, but he forced himself to walk past and into the hardware store instead. He told himself it was probably a mistake, a mislabeling on a draft plan, and that getting into an argument in the middle of the fair would do nothing but make him look unhinged. Still, the image of his farm, surrounded by neat rows of cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns, stayed with him as he made his purchases. By the time he returned to the farm, the sun was setting, casting a golden light across the fields. Rusty bounded up to greet him, tail wagging, and Noah forced himself to focus on the familiar routines that grounded him: unloading the truck, feeding the dog, checking the fences. Yet the words he had overheard at the fair replayed in his mind, nagging at him. He could not shake the feeling that something was moving against him, something bigger than he could see. He stood outside the barn for a long time, staring at its weathered boards, wondering what he would do if someone ever tried to take this place from him. Noah had never been one for dramatics. He had endured plenty of hard things in his life without resorting to rash actions, and he prided himself on being practical. But as darkness fell over the farm and the sounds of the night creatures rose from the woods, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. For the first time since returning to the farm, he felt as though the land might not be as safe, as untouchable, as he had always believed. And deep down, beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the quiet resignation that had defined him for so long, a spark of something else flickered to life. A readiness to fight if it came to that. A silent promise that he would not let anyone erase the Harper name from this land without a battle. He had no way of knowing then just how soon that promise would be tested. Noah Harper had always been a light sleeper, the sort of man who woke up at the faintest sound of wind against the siding, or Rusty pacing across the creaky floorboards of the farmhouse, but on that night in late June, it was not a subtle noise that jolted him awake. It was the unmistakable deep rumble of heavy machinery somewhere close, a guttural vibration that made the old windows tremble in their frames and set his teeth on edge. For a few seconds he lay there in the dark, disoriented and hoping it was some lingering fragment of a dream. But then another sound followed, a grinding metallic crash that resonated through the humid night air. Noah threw the covers back and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. Rusty was already up, barking low and uncertain as he followed Noah to the door. Outside, the air was thick and the moon was barely visible behind clouds, but Noah could see the dull orange glow of work lights flickering in the distance beyond the barn. He hurried down the porch steps in his bare feet, the gravel biting at his skin, and the closer he got, the louder the noise became. The steady chug of engines, the hiss of hydraulics, and the sharp, splintering crack of wood giving way. When he rounded the corner of the house and caught his first clear glimpse of what was happening, he froze in disbelief. Two massive excavators were parked on the edge of his field, their arms rising and falling in slow, deliberate arcs as they tore into the barn. One of the operators had already reduced a section of the roof to rubble, and the other was digging into the southern wall, splintering beams that had stood for 80 years into useless shards. Noah shouted before he could stop himself, the sound swallowed by the noise of the machines. He sprinted toward the barn, waving the flashlight and yelling for the operators to stop, but neither man made any move to acknowledge him. It wasn't until he was close enough to make out the reflective stripes on their vests that one of them finally killed the engine. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the destruction had been. Noah approached, breathless and furious, demanding to know what they were doing on his land in the middle of the night. The man, climbing down from the excavator, looked at him with the blank detachment of someone just doing a job. He was young, maybe late 20s, and he didn't flinch when Noah stepped close enough to smell the oil and sweat on his clothes. "Sir, we've been authorized to remove a condemned structure," the man said flatly, pulling a laminated document from his vest pocket and holding it up like a shield. The barn was deemed unsafe and ordered demolished by the town council. "We're just following instructions." Noah snatched the paper, scanning it in the beam of his flashlight, his hands shaking. The words were printed on official letterhead, complete with a stamped seal, but they might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made. There was his property's address at the top, a line declaring the barn a hazard to public safety, and a signature from someone on the council he didn't even recognize. There was also a date, issued 3 weeks earlier, but Noah had never seen the notice, never received a single letter or phone call warning him that anything like this was coming. "This is my property," he said, his voice rising. "You don't have the right to be here, and you damn sure don't have the right to tear down my barn. Get off my land now before I call the sheriff." The operator climbed back into the cab with an indifferent shrug. "Call whoever you want, sir. We're almost done." Noah lunged forward, placing himself in front of the machine as the engine rumbled back to life, and for a tense second he thought the man might actually try to move him out of the way with the excavator itself. But then the second operator leaned out of his cab, gesturing impatiently toward the open field. "You're going to want to step aside, old man. We've got 10 more minutes' work and we're leaving. If you don't move, you're just going to get hurt." Rusty barked furiously at Noah's heels, but Noah could only stand there, shaking with a combination of anger and helplessness. He realized that short of throwing himself under the tracks of the machine, there was nothing he could do to stop them. He stepped back, fists clenched, and watched as the excavators finished their grim task. One of the machines shoved the last standing section of the barn into the dirt with a sickening crunch, and when the dust settled, the structure that had stood on that land for nearly a century was gone. All that remained was a flattened pile of boards, nails, and splintered beams. Before they left, one of the workers drove a metal stake into the ground at the edge of the rubble and attached a sign. Noah's flashlight illuminated the words in bold black letters. "Danger. Condemned structure removed by order of the council. No trespassing." Then the machines rumbled back toward the road, their taillights glowing red in the dark like the retreating eyes of some great beast. Noah stood alone in the silence that followed, the night air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and torn earth. He felt hollow, as if some vital part of himself had been ripped out along with the barn. That building had been more than just a collection of wood and nails. It had been a repository of family history, the place where his father had taught him to drive the old tractor, where he and Clara had once danced barefoot to a crackling radio late. On a summer night, where generations of Harpers had stored their tools and hopes for the future. Now it was rubble, and the men who had destroyed it had vanished as abruptly as they had appeared. He stumbled through the wreckage, kicking aside boards and twisted sheets of metal, hoping against hope to salvage something, anything. That was when he remembered the documents. Nearly every piece of paper proving his legal claim to the land, the deed, tax records, and decades-old correspondence from the county clerk, had been stored in a locked metal cabinet in the barn's loft. He had always meant to move them into the house, but the cabinet was heavy, and he had told himself there was no rush. Now, as he stared at the mangled remains of the loft, he felt the blood drain from his face. The cabinet was gone, destroyed or buried somewhere beneath tons of debris. Without those papers, how could he prove the land was his? Noah stayed outside until the first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, unable to make himself go back inside. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. As soon as the courthouse opened, he drove into town, his truck tires spitting gravel as he pushed the old engine harder than he should have. At the clerk's office, he demanded copies of his property records, only to be told by a harried-looking woman behind the counter that the county was in the middle of digitizing older files and that his particular records were temporarily unavailable. When Noah pressed for a timeline, she simply shook her head and muttered something about how the council's development initiatives had created a backlog. He left the office with nothing but a sick, twisting feeling in his gut. It was not just the barn they had taken from him. They were erasing him, one piece at a time, and they were doing it with the quiet efficiency of people who knew no one could stop them. Noah Harper sat behind the wheel of his truck for several minutes outside the county office, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The words temporarily unavailable and backlog kept echoing in his head as if they had any meaning beyond what he already understood. His land records had vanished into some bureaucratic void, and without them, he was essentially invisible. The barn was gone, the proof of ownership gone, and there was nothing tangible left to hold on to. He thought about driving back to the farm, about just collapsing into the worn couch and pretending for a few hours that this wasn't happening, but he knew the second he walked into that empty house the weight of it would crush him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the few contacts he still had saved, hesitating over each name until he stopped on one. James Wallace, the attorney who had handled his father's estate 15 years earlier and one of the last. People Noah still trusted. James answered on the second ring, his voice gruff and wary until Noah identified himself. They arranged to meet at James's office on Main Street that afternoon. Noah spent the hours in between driving aimlessly, Rusty in the passenger seat, while his mind spun through every worst-case scenario. By the time he walked through the door of the cramped office, he was wound so tight he could barely sit still. James looked older, thinner, his once black hair now completely gray, but his eyes were sharp as ever as he listened to Noah's story. When Noah finished describing the demolition, the missing documents, and the dead end at the county clerk's office, James leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath through his nose. "This is bigger than just a mistake," James said quietly. "The council has been pushing hard to clear land for that Haven Heights development. You're not the first property owner they've gone after, though they usually try to buy people out before it comes to this." He tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking. "I'll make some calls, see if I can find out what's happening behind the scenes, but you need to be careful. These people don't like obstacles, and right now you're standing in the way of a lot of money." Noah nodded, though the warning made his stomach tighten. He had known James for years and had never heard him sound so serious. He left the office with a promise from James to call as soon as he learned anything. As Noah stepped back onto the busy sidewalk, he was acutely aware of how out of place he felt in town now, like a man marked in some way he couldn't see. He noticed the glances people gave him, quick, assessing, and then immediately averted, and it made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. He told himself it was paranoia, but when he returned to his truck he was certain a black SUV parked a few spaces away had not been there earlier. Its windows were tinted so dark he couldn't see inside, but the engine was idling, and when he pulled out of the lot, the SUV followed at a discreet distance. Noah took the long way home, weaving through back roads to test his suspicion. Each time he changed direction, the SUV did the same, always far enough behind to maintain plausible deniability but close enough that he could feel its presence. Finally, 2 miles from the farm, he slowed suddenly and pulled into a narrow dirt track leading into the woods. He waited, heart pounding, but the SUV kept going, disappearing around the bend without so much as a brake light. Noah sat there for several minutes, breathing hard before continuing home. The farmhouse felt colder than usual when he walked inside, its silence oppressive. He fed Rusty and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the scar where the barn had been, still raw and ugly. He thought about the men in the excavators and how casually they had destroyed a piece of his life. He thought about the SUV and the clerk's polite evasions and the map he had seen at the fair that already counted his land among the future lots of Haven Heights. A knot of anger formed in his chest, but it was tangled up with something else, something heavier, fear. That night he was jolted awake again, not by machinery this time, but by the sharp crack of gravel under tires. He slipped out of bed and padded to the window, heart hammering. A pair of headlights swept across the yard and then went dark, leaving only the faint outline of a vehicle parked near the edge of the property. He couldn't see who was inside. For several minutes, nothing happened, and then the car pulled away slowly, its engine barely audible as it rolled down the driveway and vanished. Noah stood at the window for a long time afterward, watching the empty yard until he finally forced himself back to bed. The next morning, he found something wedged into the slats of his front gate, a plain, white envelope with his name typed on the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message printed in block letters. "Leave now, while you still can." No signature, no explanation. Noah felt his hands tremble as he read the words again and again. He had no idea who had left the note, but he understood the intent. He called James immediately, relaying what had happened. James's voice was tight with concern as he told Noah to document everything, take photos of the envelope, keep a record of each incident, and to be cautious about who he spoke to. "I'm still making calls," James said. "But Noah, you need to understand something. If they're escalating to intimidation, it's because they want you scared enough to walk away. Don't give them that satisfaction." Noah hung up, the lawyer's words ringing in his ears. He spent the rest of the day making practical preparations. He installed new locks on the doors and windows, checked the batteries on the motion sensor lights, and dug his old hunting rifle out of the closet even though he hated the thought of having to use it. He also began making digital copies of every piece of paperwork he could find related to the property, the most recent tax bill, old correspondence, anything that might help establish his claim, and stored the files on an external drive he hid in the cellar. That afternoon, as he was repairing a section of fence at the edge of the pasture, he saw two men in collared shirts and slacks standing on the road beyond his gate. They were pretending to examine a set of rolled-up plans, but Noah could feel their eyes on him. When he walked toward them, they stepped back casually as if they had every right to be there. "Can I help you?" Noah called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The taller of the two men smiled thinly. "Just surveying for upcoming improvements," he said, gesturing vaguely to the plans. "Nothing for you to worry about, sir." "This is private property," Noah said. "You need to leave." The man's smile never faltered, but his eyes hardened. "We're on a public right-of-way, Mr. Harper. We're not breaking any laws. Have a good day." Noah watched them walk back to a waiting pickup truck and drive off, his pulse racing. He knew they were lying. He knew they were assessing his land, calculating how quickly they could erase him from it. That night he sat at the kitchen table staring at the scattered paperwork, the external drive, and the rifle leaning against the wall. He was not a man prone to dramatics or rash decisions, but he understood now that the people behind Haven Heights were not going to stop until they had taken everything from him. And for the first time since Clara's death he felt something ignite inside him. Not just anger, but a cold, deliberate determination. He would not make it easy for them. Noah Harper had not slept properly in more than a week, each night spent half awake, listening for the sound of tires on gravel or strangers moving through the shadows outside his windows. The threat left at his gate and the constant sense of being watched had stripped away any illusion that this was a misunderstanding. Someone wanted him off his land, and they were willing to use fear as a tool. He had followed James Wallace's advice to document everything: photographs of the envelope and the note, logs of every unusual car parked nearby, written records of each encounter with men who claimed to be surveyors. But none of it had lessened the pressure building inside him. The barn was gone, his legal documents were gone, and his confidence in the county's willingness to help had evaporated the moment the clerk dismissed his questions about his property records. James called late one evening, his voice low and tense. "I've been digging," he said without preamble, "and I finally got someone off the record to confirm what I suspected. The council has already signed a preliminary agreement to sell your land, Noah, to a development group out of state. They're calling it a public good initiative, which gives them leeway to seize property through eminent domain if necessary. You're listed as a non-cooperative owner, and they've budgeted for legal challenges, but the plan is to move forward whether you like it or not." Noah gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. "They can't do that," he said, though even as he spoke he knew that they could. The phrase "public good" had been used to justify countless land grabs in the past, and he had no illusions about how much the council cared about a solitary farmer standing in the way of millions of dollars in development contracts. James sighed. "I wish I had better news. There might still be a way to fight this, but you'd need money, a team of attorneys, and time, none of which you have. And even then, you'd be going up against the same people who control the records you need to prove ownership. This is the playbook they've been using for years, and it works because most people can't afford to resist." He paused. "I'm telling you this so you understand the stakes. They're not going to stop." After the call ended, Noah sat in the dark kitchen with Rusty curled at his feet, staring at the blank space where the barn had once stood. He felt cornered in a way he never had before, but there was a clarity to it as well. The slow erosion of his life, the demolitions, the threats, the missing records, was no longer something he could hope would resolve itself. If he didn't act, he would lose everything, and no one would remember the Harpers had ever lived on that land. The next day, Noah drove into town with a plan forming in his mind. He knew that every decision the council made and every deal they struck was funneled through the community center, the modern brick building at the edge of town where they held their meetings, processed permits, and kept their archives. He had avoided the place for years, but now he needed to see it for himself. He parked down the street and watched as people came and went, most carrying files or rolling briefcases. After an hour, he recognized one of the council members leaving the building, and he seized the opportunity. He followed the man at a distance to a cafe 2 blocks away and waited until he stepped inside, then slipped into the community center through a side door just as an employee was taking out the trash. Inside, the building was brighter and more modern than he expected, with polished floors and glass-walled offices that gave the illusion of transparency. Noah kept his head down and moved with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there. He passed a series of framed photographs of council members cutting ribbons at various construction sites before reaching a hallway lined with locked filing cabinets. At the end of the hall, through a partially open door, he saw a large room dominated by a conference table. On the far wall was a detailed scale model of the Haven Heights development, complete with miniature houses, roads, and green spaces. Noah felt his stomach drop when he saw the Harper property marked clearly in the southern section, already divided into neat rectangular lots. He stepped closer, scanning the names printed on the placards stuck into the model. Several of them belonged to major investors he recognized from local news stories, but 2 stood out: a county judge whose rulings had frequently favored development companies, and the deputy mayor who had recently been touting Haven Heights as the future of the town. Noah felt a cold wave of understanding wash over him. This wasn't simply a council initiative. It was a coordinated effort backed by people with the power to shape laws and destroy lives without consequence. The sound of footsteps in the hall snapped him out of his thoughts. He ducked into a supply closet just as 2 staffers entered the conference room, their voices low as they discussed Phase 2 funding and fast-tracking demolition schedules. Noah held his breath, every muscle tense until they left. When he finally slipped out of the building, heart hammering, he knew two things with absolute certainty. The council was not going to stop, and no legal avenue available to him would be enough to save his land. That night, Noah sat at the kitchen table with the rifle leaning against the wall and the external drive of property records beside him. Thinking about the scale model of Haven Heights, he could see every piece of their plan now, how they had erased him on paper before they ever set foot on his land. He had spent his life avoiding conflict, but there was no room left for hesitation. If he wanted to stop them, he would have to hit them where it hurt most, and that meant going after the community center, the place where their power was centralized, where their records and evidence of their corruption were stored. For the first time since the barn was demolished, Noah felt the ember of something beyond fear and grief take hold inside him. It was resolve, sharp and unrelenting. He began making a list of everything he would need to do, every step he would have to take, to ensure that when he struck, there would be no undoing it. Noah Harper knew that after what he had seen at the community center, there was no longer any question about whether the council would eventually take his land. The only question was how soon they would act and how ruthless they would be in the process. The model of Haven Heights, with his property already carved into neat little parcels, had made one thing clear. In their minds, he was already gone. They were simply waiting for the right moment to push him off the board. That knowledge filled him with a deep, simmering anger, but it also forced him to think with more clarity than he had in weeks. If he was going to survive this, he needed to be deliberate, to prepare, to act in ways that would not give them the excuse they were so obviously trying to provoke. He started by reinforcing the farm itself, not because he believed he could hold off a serious attempt to remove him by force, but because it gave him time to think and plan. He repaired the fence lines, set up additional lighting around the perimeter, and checked every door and window for weaknesses. He walked the property at night with Rusty, learning the rhythms of the place so that he would know immediately if something was out of place. It gave him a fragile sense of control, even as he knew control was the one thing slipping away from him. James Wallace called twice during those first few days, once to tell him that the council had formally scheduled a vote on Phase 2 of the Haven Heights project, and again to warn him that he had heard whispers Noah's property was already considered forfeited. "They're moving faster than I expected," James said grimly. "I'm not sure there's anything I can do at this point. I've been advised, strongly, to stop asking questions." Noah could hear the defeat in his friend's voice and knew James had likely been threatened in the same quiet, efficient way he had. The threats toward Noah himself became more overt. One afternoon, as he returned from a supply run into town, he found the farmhouse door ajar, the lock splintered. He entered cautiously, rifle in hand, and discovered that someone had ransacked the place. Drawers had been pulled out and dumped on the floor, furniture overturned, every cabinet and closet left gaping open. Nothing of obvious value was missing, but Noah understood the message. "We can reach you any time we want." He took photographs of the damage and sent them to James, who told him to file a police report. Noah did, but the deputy who eventually showed up treated the incident like a trivial break-in, taking notes without much interest and leaving with a vague promise to let him know if anything turns up. Noah did not expect to hear from them again. That night, unable to sleep, he went through the photographs on his phone and began cataloging everything else he had collected. The anonymous note left at his gate, the photographs of the men surveying his land, the voicemail from James warning him about the council's intentions. He backed it all up to multiple drives and left one in a safety deposit box in a neighboring county. It was a small comfort to know that if something happened to him, at least a record of what was being done might survive. A week later, just as Noah was beginning to feel the strain of waiting for the next blow to fall, the deputy mayor himself arrived at the farm. Noah was outside, repairing a section of the corral fence, when a sleek black sedan pulled up the driveway and came to a stop a few yards away. The deputy mayor stepped out with the confident air of a man who was used to getting his way. He was well-dressed, smiling in a way that was meant to seem friendly but only made Noah's stomach twist. "Mr. Harper," the deputy mayor said, walking forward with his hands raised slightly as if approaching a skittish animal. "I thought it was time we spoke directly." Noah wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned on the fence, watching him without responding. "You've made this more complicated than it needs to be," the deputy mayor continued. "No one wants to see you lose everything. That's not the goal here. The goal is progress. Haven Heights will bring jobs, infrastructure, tax revenue. This town needs that. You're holding on to something that's already gone, and for what? Sentiment." Noah's jaw tightened. "This land is mine. It's been in my family for generations, and you had no right to tear down my barn." The deputy mayor's smile thinned. "The barn was a safety hazard, Mr. Harper. You know that. It was condemned according to the proper procedures. What I'm offering you now is a chance to avoid further unpleasantness. We can arrange a buyout above market value. Enough for you to start over anywhere you like. All you have to do is sign the paperwork, and this will be over." "And if I don't?" Noah asked. The man's smile vanished completely. "Then you force us to take more formal measures. You'll lose the land either way, but it will be less comfortable for you. I don't think either of us wants that." Noah stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Get off my property." The deputy mayor studied him, perhaps expecting Noah to break, to fold as so many others must have before him. When Noah did not waver, the man gave a small nod, returned to his car, and drove away without another word. 2 nights later, the farm was attacked. Noah woke to the sound of breaking glass and the unmistakable whoosh of fire catching. He raced downstairs to find flames licking at the side of the farmhouse where someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through a window. He grabbed the fire extinguisher and managed to smother the flames before they spread, coughing from the acrid smoke, his heart hammering. Rusty barked frantically as Noah searched the yard with a flashlight, but whoever had done it was already gone. Noah called the sheriff's office again, but this time no one came. He left a voicemail for James explaining what had happened and spent the rest of the night boarding up the broken window. By dawn, he knew what he had to do. The time for waiting was over. He drove to a small equipment rental yard in a neighboring county and paid cash for the use of a heavy-duty bulldozer, telling the clerk he was repairing damage from a storm. He arranged for the machine to be delivered under the pretense of clearing debris, and when it arrived, he parked it in a shed out of sight from the road. He then began studying the layout of the community center. Noah visited town twice in the days that followed, blending in as best he could while he observed the building. He noted the location of the entrances, the placement of cameras, the patterns of staff and visitors coming and going. He learned that every Thursday evening the building hosted Bingo Night, a community tradition that drew nearly every council member and senior staffer into one place at the same time. It was, he realized, the perfect opportunity. But Noah was not reckless. He had no intention of harming innocent people, and he knew that destroying the building would only be justified if he could be sure it was empty. He spent hours planning, walking through contingencies, timing how long it would take to reach the structural weaknesses he had noticed during his earlier visit. He remembered the old ditches and drainage channels beneath the southern wing of the building, where the foundation had been extended in violation of code. If those supports were compromised, the entire structure would collapse into the hollow beneath it. On the morning of Bingo Night, Noah finalized his preparations. He loaded the external drives and documentation into a sealed envelope and left it with a trusted acquaintance in the next county, along with instructions to deliver it to the state attorney general's office if he did not return within 48 hours. He spent the afternoon quietly, sitting on the porch with Rusty, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. As dusk settled, he drove the bulldozer out of the shed and onto the back roads that would lead him to town. He parked a quarter-mile from the community center and waited, watching as cars filled the lot. He could see people laughing and talking as they entered the brightly lit building, unaware of the role they played in the machine that had taken so much from him. He waited until the lights inside flickered in a way that told him bingo had begun, that everyone was seated and focused. Then he started the bulldozer and rolled toward the building. His plan was not to ram through the front like some cinematic act of revenge. Instead, he circled to the rear, where the southern wing jutted out over the drainage channel. He used the machine's blade to dig into the earth around the foundation, working with methodical precision. The ground began to tremble as the supports shifted, but Noah did not stop until he felt the first unmistakable lurch of the structure giving way. Then he backed the bulldozer away and watched as the southern wing buckled, pulling the rest of the building down with it in a deafening roar of collapsing concrete and steel. Noah sat there for a long moment in the darkened cab, breathing hard, as dust billowed into the night sky. He had done what he set out to do. The community center, the hub of the council's power and the repository of their records, was gone. He did not wait to see who might come running from the neighboring buildings. He turned the bulldozer toward the road and drove back into the darkness, knowing there was no going back now. Noah Harper did not sleep that night. After leaving the destroyed community center behind him, he drove the bulldozer through the back roads, weaving aimlessly until he reached the edge of his county, where he abandoned the machine in a stand of trees and walked for nearly 2 miles. Before calling a cab from a burner phone he had purchased weeks earlier. When the driver dropped him off a mile from the farm, he moved carefully through the fields in the darkness, avoiding the driveway and the road in case anyone was watching. By the time he reached the porch of the farmhouse, the sun was beginning to rise. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the smell of the earth and the distant smoke from town, knowing that his world had shifted irrevocably. He expected the authorities to arrive by mid-morning, but the silence stretched on, unnatural and tense. Noah stayed inside, listening for the crunch of tires on the gravel drive, every creak of the old house making his muscles tense. Around noon, James Wallace called from a number Noah didn't recognize, his voice tight and nearly frantic. "Noah, what the hell did you do? The entire community center is gone, collapsed into the ground like it was made of sand. The council's in chaos and the state police have been called in. They're treating it like arson or sabotage. You need to get out of there now." Noah closed his eyes and leaned against the wall, the phone warm against his ear. "It's done," he said quietly. "I've got nothing left to lose, James." "That's exactly what they're going to tell the press," James snapped. "You need to think about what happens next. They're going to come for you with everything they have." "And Noah, you need to understand, this isn't going to end with an arrest. If they find you, I don't think they're planning to take you alive." Noah said nothing. He knew James was right. The destruction of the community center had done more than wipe out the council's hub of power and their archives. It had humiliated them. For years, they had operated with quiet impunity, erasing anyone who stood in their way without public scrutiny. Now they would be forced to explain to the state and the developers why their project had collapsed, literally, and someone would have to take the blame. By late afternoon, Noah could see the evidence of the hunt beginning. Helicopters thumped overhead, circling the woods beyond his property. Unmarked SUVs cruised the roads with deliberate slowness, and he spotted men with rifles moving through the tree line half a mile away. Rusty paced nervously from window to window, ears pricked at every sound. Noah packed a small bag with food, water, and a few essential items, then hesitated at the door, looking back at the house one last time. He had rebuilt his life here after Clara's death, finding a fragile kind of peace in the routines of the farm, and now he was leaving it behind again, maybe forever. As dusk fell, Noah slipped out through the woods behind the property, moving silently, every step measured. He avoided the main roads and doubled back twice to ensure he wasn't being followed. He reached the rendezvous point he had arranged days earlier, a small cabin on the edge of a neighboring county where a friend of James's had agreed to shelter him for a night. But when he arrived, the cabin was empty. its door ajar. Noah felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as he stepped inside. The place had been searched, the contents of drawers and cabinets scattered across the floor. He turned to leave, but the sound of an engine outside froze him in place. A black SUV rolled up the dirt path and stopped 20 yards from the cabin. 4 men stepped out, dressed in tactical gear with rifles slung across their chests. Noah ducked behind the doorway as the men spread out, 2 circling around the back of the cabin while the other 2 moved toward the front. He could hear the crunch of their boots on the gravel, the faint murmur of their voices as they communicated in clipped professional tones. These weren't local deputies or state police. These were the council's people, the same kind of private contractors who had demolished his barn in the middle of the night without consequence. Noah slipped out a side window and crawled beneath the deck as the men entered the cabin. He could hear them moving inside, opening doors, overturning furniture, searching for him. He waited until the noise was directly above him, then crawled out the far side and bolted into the woods, Rusty close at his heels. Shouts erupted behind him as the men realized he was gone, followed by the crack of gunfire. Bullets tore through the trees around him as he ran, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. He didn't stop until he reached the creek a quarter-mile away, plunging into the icy water and letting the current carry him downstream before pulling himself out on the opposite bank. By the time he staggered into a clearing, soaked and shivering, night had fallen completely. Noah collapsed against a tree, chest heaving, trying to quiet his breathing. He could still hear distant voices in the woods, the faint glow of flashlights bobbing through the darkness. But they were moving in the wrong direction now. He had escaped, for the moment. He thought about disappearing completely, about slipping across state lines and starting over somewhere no one would ever find him. But he knew that wasn't truly possible. The council and the developers they served would not stop just because the community center was gone. They would rebuild, find new ways to consolidate their power, and they would continue to crush anyone who got in their way. If Noah left now, he would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, and the people who had destroyed everything he loved would face no consequences. That thought hardened something inside him. He had struck a blow, yes, but it wasn't enough. The files and evidence stored at the community center had been destroyed in the collapse, but Noah still had his own documentation, the backup drives and photographs he had hidden away. He realized that the only way to finish this was to make their corruption undeniable, to ensure the story reached far beyond the small-town media they could manipulate. He would have to take the evidence directly to someone powerful enough to act on it, and he would have to do it quickly before the council could recover and erase him entirely. Noah waited until the woods fell silent again, then pushed himself to his feet and began the long walk back toward the farmhouse. He moved cautiously, staying off the roads, but by the time he reached the property, the SUVs and armed men were gone. The house stood in eerie silence, its windows dark. He slipped inside and retrieved the envelope containing the external drives and photographs from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in the study. Then he packed the rest of what he might need, a change of clothes, extra ammunition for the rifle, a handful of cash, and stepped back out into the night without looking back. He drove through the dark back roads until he reached the highway, where he merged into the flow of traffic heading north. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of the council and its enforcers, lay the possibility of justice. Noah gripped the wheel and focused on the road, the envelope of evidence resting on the passenger seat beside him like a lifeline. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the most dangerous part of his journey was still to come. Noah Harper drove north through the darkness until the highway lights thinned out and the road became a narrow ribbon cutting through unfamiliar countryside. He had no real destination, only a direction, but the urgency in his chest propelled him forward. He stopped once for fuel at a station just across the state line, pulling his cap low over his face as he filled the tank and bought a coffee, conscious of every glance from the attendant behind the counter. He could imagine his face already being circulated among law enforcement and private contractors alike, labeled a fugitive, a terrorist, anything but the man who had been pushed into a corner by the people now hunting him. When he returned to the car, he opened the glove box to check the envelope again, running his fingers over the thick paper as if to reassure himself it was still there. Inside were the hard drives containing every photograph, every document, every record he had gathered, the only proof left of what had been done to him and to others before him. Without that evidence, everything he had done, the risks he had taken, the destruction of the community center, it would all have been for nothing. By mid-morning, Noah reached a city large enough to disappear into for a while. He parked the car in a crowded garage and walked several blocks, scanning the streets for anyone who might be following. The downtown buildings loomed overhead, glass and steel catching the sunlight, so different from the weathered structures of his small town that it was disorienting. He found a cheap motel on a side street and paid for a room in cash, using a false name he had rehearsed in case anyone asked questions. Once inside, he locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the past weeks settle over him like a weight. He knew he could not stay there long. The council's reach was extensive, and they would eventually trace him, but he needed to rest and plan his next move. He switched on the television for the first time since leaving home, and was greeted with images of the collapsed community center. The news anchor's voice was calm and practiced as she spoke of suspected sabotage and unconfirmed reports of a person of interest, though she never mentioned Noah's name. He could tell from the footage, the way cameras lingered on the council members looking grave for the press, that they were already shaping the narrative. They would paint themselves as victims of a violent loner, a man who had lashed out irrationally, and they would bury the truth about why the building had really fallen. Noah switched off the television, his jaw tight. He thought about calling James Wallace, about letting his friend know he was safe, but he stopped himself. The fewer people who knew where he was, the better. Instead, he opened the envelope and spread its contents out on the bed. There was a list of names and companies connected to Haven Heights, copies of the secret agreements the council had made to transfer land, photographs of the anonymous threats, and a timeline of everything that had happened to him. He organized it all into a single packet and stared at it for a long time, wondering if it would be enough. The next day, he walked into the office of the state attorney general without an appointment and asked to speak to an investigator. He expected to be turned away, but when he quietly explained what he had and slid a single photograph across the reception desk, a photograph of the deputy mayor signing a document transferring property that legally wasn't his, the receptionist's demeanor changed. Within minutes, Noah was escorted to a private office where a serious-looking woman in a tailored suit listened carefully as he explained his story. He handed her the packet of evidence and waited as she leafed through it, her expression hardening with each page. "This is enough to open a case," she said finally. "But you need to understand, Mr. Harper, that this will not be quick or easy. The people involved in this have resources, and they will fight back. We can offer you protection while the investigation proceeds, but you'll have to trust us." Noah met her gaze and nodded. "I don't have anything left to lose." In the weeks that followed, the investigation began quietly but steadily. Subpoenas were issued, accounts were frozen, and the council members who had once seemed untouchable suddenly found themselves answering difficult questions. Noah watched it unfold from a safe house the Attorney General's office arranged for him, each small victory bringing with it a mixture of relief and grief. He had wanted justice, and he was beginning to see glimmers of it, but it came at the cost of everything he had known. One morning, James Wallace appeared at the safe house with Rusty in tow, the dog bounding toward Noah with unrestrained joy. James embraced him awkwardly, his eyes damp. "They're going to rebuild, you know," James said quietly. "Not the community center, the whole system. People like that always do. But you did something they'll never forget." Noah stood on the porch with Rusty at his side, looking out at the horizon. He knew James was right. The fight was far from over, and the people who had destroyed his life would try to regain what they had lost. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He had taken back a measure of control, and he had ensured that the truth would outlive him. When the Attorney General's office eventually offered him the chance to return to his land, now locked in litigation, Noah declined. He had already made his decision. He left the state quietly, carrying little more than a bag of clothes and the dog who had never left his side, heading west toward places he had never been. He did not know what waited for him there, only that it would be a life he had